Hi guys, just before we start the episode today, whatever platform you are listening to this on, whether it be on the podcast, Apple Podcast, YouTube, whatever it is, please support it. Please like, subscribe, whatever you can do. We want to reach as many people as possible. So please do that and we'll get right into the episode. Welcome to another episode of the Chronic Comeback podcast. Today, I am honoured and excited to have on the show Ashok Gupta, who many of you will know is the founder and creator of the Gupta Program. Ashok himself, if you don't know, and we're going to go into this, actually suffered from ME, CFS, and managed to make a full recovery. And we'll go into that because I don't know how much of you know that story. And after that, made it his lifelong quest to help others recover from similar chronic conditions. His 20 years of research, combined with the latest findings around neuroplasticity, led him to believe that these conditions are ultimately caused by abnormalities in brain function, which we've talked a lot about on this podcast, and which also can actually be reversed using revolutionary brain retraining techniques called Amygdala and Insula Retraining. So he developed the Gupta Program to help treat all kinds of chronic illnesses, and thousands of people have been able to get their lives back as a result using this treatment. So thank you so much for sparing the time, Ashok. How are you doing?
Yeah, lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
No worries. Okay, cool. So if we could, before we get into, we've got a load of questions that were sent over that I'll do my best to get through. But could you just give us a little bit of background into your own story and how this came about? I wonder whether some people knowing of your program, whether they actually realized that this was started because you actually had health problems yourself. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So like many of us who have come along this journey and are now looking to help others, it's as a result of our own challenges, our own illnesses that we've been through. So when I was studying as an undergrad, I was at Cambridge and I was studying 4 years, a 3 or 4 year program. And in the second year, I went to India at the end of the second year and I got some kind of stomach bug, which most people do when they go to India. And then I came back and I thought the stomach bug would go, but actually it just continued. It just continued and continued. And my stomach symptoms got better, but my overall body was continually reacting. And I suddenly went downhill to the point at which if I'd open up a textbook, I couldn't even read the words on the page. I couldn't even remember anything on the page. Or I would sometimes have to crawl to the bathroom because my body literally had no energy. And you think, what on earth is this? I mean, this is a brick wall in front of you as a young man. So I went from doctor to doctor saying, look, I've got this, what's going on? And they would say, we've done all of these tests, but we can't find anything wrong. You may have this thing called ME or chronic fatigue syndrome. And we have no idea what it is. We have no idea what causes it. We have no treatment for it. And pretty much, rest and kind of see what happens, And then they'd prescribe me antidepressants saying, maybe you're depressed and that's why you have it, which actually made me feel worse. And I realized that the only thing that was helping me was, pulling back on activities to a certain degree and trying to take some rest. But I might rest for a whole 2 weeks, but not necessarily feel better. So I realized that this was not about exertion. This was something going on in the body and in the brain that was causing this, like a kind of vicious cycle, something going on that I couldn't really figure out. So I remember in my darkest day where I literally almost felt suicidal. And I'd obviously met many people who suffered from it. In those days, we didn't really have a mature internet, but I'd seen that there were lots of people who suffered. I'd gone to support groups and I thought, if I can just figure this out, I will dedicate the rest of my life to helping others with these chronic conditions, And that started me on that journey and that quest to understand it. So then I read lots of brain neurology. I don't know why, I was just automatically attracted to that area of science. And I read books and read articles. And then I also studied general physiology and I studied the condition and different books on the illnesses in those days. And I started understanding, okay, I see some patterns here. And one book that really inspired me was called The Neurology of Emotion by Professor Joseph Ledoux. And he was one of the foremost experts in the 90s on a brain structure called the amygdala, which we'll talk more about. And so the amygdala kind of sits behind your eyes. as your kind of danger signal response, your fight or flight response. So I studied a lot of that and realized that that kind of research was very much focusing on emotions and emotional reactions. But what happens if our brain also creates immunological reactions and physiological reactions in the same pattern through that same brain structure? So I studied so many different things, and I then started experimenting with my own brain. Not my mind, but my brain and the periphery of my consciousness, and realized and noticed certain patterns that were going on. Once again, I definitely don't say this is psychological, but it's on the periphery. And I managed to ad hoc train my brain, got better and better, and got then 100% better, and published my medical hypothesis in 2002. So it was actually published online in 1999 and then published in Medical Hypotheses Journal in 2002. And then I set up a clinic to treat others because I thought, well, I've been able to do it. Others will be able to do it. And of course, you realize it's a little more complex when you start dealing with the complexity of these different types of illnesses. But I persevered, and I gradually created a set of programs and a set of techniques, because my only aim was I wanted to see people better, because there's a huge amount of suffering, which is unacknowledged through these conditions. So a lot of research money goes into cancer or heart disease or these different illnesses because they're seen as more life-threatening. But there's just an equivalent amount of suffering from people in all of these different areas: mold illness, fibromyalgia. And I really wanted to help people with this. I saw this huge amount of suffering and lives wasted. And gradually I found something that worked most of the time for most people. And I published that treatment online in 2007. So we were the first, brain retraining neuroplasticity program in 2007. And since then we've had many iterations. We've published obviously many different medical studies showing, effectiveness of our treatment. And we're doing further research now. But in terms of my personal journey, I recognize that there were things about my background, so childhood experiences, traumas, etc., which now fit with our hypothesis that we almost are pre-trained to getting these types of illnesses based on our past experiences. Now, once again, it doesn't mean it's psychological, but we do know that people who've been through adverse childhood experiences, traumas, abuse, are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience chronic illness later in life. So there is definitely a connection with that.
So what intrigues me is that how it's taken me so long to come to truly believe that it's not like a physical thing. Do you know what I mean? As in, I can't just get something to take that will take whatever it is that's inside me and get rid of it. And and it's been a gradual process. So I was first exposed to this kind of idea a few years ago. I kind of believed it intellectually, and then I'd go back to try and treating the symptoms, and then I'd come back, and now I'm like all in. And it's interesting. I speak to a few people who are earlier on in their journey, and I can see that they're still where I was. And I want them to be where I am now and believe it more. It seems to me you moved very quickly into that way of thinking. What was it about, what was going on for you that made you think, okay, this isn't a physical thing? Because I think a lot of people would probably start trying to go into the stomach bug, and then they would do loads and loads of tests. Like, how did you get to that way of thinking so quickly?
Yeah. I think the first thing is that we definitely we recognize that there are physical aspects to this. So these are real physical illnesses in the sense of the downstream effects. Yeah. So we know there's muscle abnormalities, there's cytokine abnormalities, there's brain inflammation. So there's a huge amount of physical things going on physically in the body. But what the conclusion I came to, and an analogy I give is, let's say a car, right? So, in the 80s and 90s, if you had a car, the electrical system was pretty basic, right? So things would go wrong with the engine, you'd fix the engine. Yeah, and that's how modern medicine works. Something wrong with the stomach, let's go in there, look at the enzymes, look at the nutrients and fix that. There's something wrong with the tires, right? Let's go and fix the tires. So in medicine, this is the reductionist philosophy. Reduce everything down to its smallest area and fix that. Yeah. But actually in modern cars, what tends to be the thing that goes wrong? It's the electrical system. The electrical systems that connect all the different parts of the car. You always have to go in and reset it in the garage, or something's gone wrong. And so it is with our bodies, that modern medicine is brilliant at treating the hardware problems. So those are infections invading the body, or, you've got a deficiency in a certain vitamin or mineral or whatever it may be. But what modern medicine isn't good at doing, or is beginning to be better at doing, is solving software issues. So the way to look at it, so the way I looked at it back in those days was, this is about a system and a function of the entire body, rather than something downstream going wrong. Because I would attend conferences, and in that conference, every single branch of medicine would be represented. So someone from the immunological department would say, look, we found these abnormalities in the immune system. Someone from psychology would say, well, look, we find that people have these, higher peptides and these emotional challenges. There would be someone from the physiology department, there would be rheumatologists. Everyone's saying, we found an abnormality. Yeah. And the analogy I use is, it's like standing on a bridge and you see someone drowning. So you jump in and you pull that person out. You think, oh, I'm brilliant. I'm going to manage to save that person. And then another person's drowning. So you jump in and you save that person. But no one's asking the question, who on earth is throwing these people into the river in the first place? Like, let's go upstream the river and figure out the root cause of why is the body going into this alternate state and creating all these downstream problems in the physical body. And so I came up with that conclusion early on, that this wasn't about the minutiae of my muscles, my mitochondria, this, that, and the other. Sure, they're malfunctioning, but what is telling it to malfunction? And that's when I went upstream and looked at how the brain works. Yeah. And I think the number one thing that I really understood from Professor Joseph Ledoux was our systems are wired to help us survive. Yeah. So the number one priority of our brain and our body is to survive. And that's why we have emotional responses, fight or flight. Yeah. Now, what happens if those fight or flight responses become chronic? Well, we then experience anxiety or we experience trauma. Yeah. But in the same way, I took that analogy for physiological illnesses, that physiological illnesses are even more life-threatening than a wild tiger to some extent. Mm-hmm. So what happens if the brain also goes into those altered, overprotective states in physiological reactions? And that was a conclusion I came to, that the physical body is just ensuring survival by going into this altered state. And that makes logical sense, that nothing's actually going wrong as far as the brain and the body are concerned, because it's more worried about your survival than it is your health and well-being. Mm-hmm. Our brains and our systems are designed over these millions of years of evolution to help us survive, pass on our genes to the next generation. Mm-hmm. So if we're under threat, the system will go into this altered state and continue to create these symptoms because it's overprotecting us. So that's where I really concluded this is a software problem, not a hardware problem.
When you actually come to that realization, and when I say you, I mean the collective you, when I, kind of came to that realization, it's actually far more of a comforting thought, because when you have this laundry list of, Lyme disease, mold, all of these things, it's overwhelming, because you think it's going to take me forever to try and, plug all these gaps. And then actually, when you think about it as a software problem, once you're able to sort that out, everything else downstream should sort out, right? That's the kind of theory behind it. Is that right?
Absolutely. And even our hypothesis explains why people get multiple diagnoses of different things. And many of our clients who have 4 or 5 diagnoses, once they do the brain retraining, all of them just tend to dissolve away, or they may have one that remains, but they can then deal with that one in perhaps a different way. But generally, the whole system resets and come back to normal. And the number one thing is, when we get our system back to its normal functioning state, it is its own best healer. Mm. Yeah, it can deal with opportunistic infections like Lyme. It can deal with sensitivity reactions to mold. It can deal with fatigue. All of those things. It can deal with healing the gut once it's in the right state and it's no longer in this emergency state, essentially.
Do you see, when someone comes to you, I don't know, you don't run a clinic anymore, do you? It's not like you have a patient, or do you have like specific...
I don't see patients one-on-one, but we have now 20 to 30 practitioners around the world who see people over Zoom or one-on-one face-to-face.
But let's say you did, and there was one person that came to you, with Lyme disease, one person that came to you with rheumatoid arthritis, one person that came to you with fibromyalgia. As a person, as a practitioner, and you're looking at those people, do you see them as the same essentially, and you would treat them the same? And do you even pay attention to those labels anymore?
We do pay attention to those labels because there are differences in the manifestation of those symptoms. Yeah. Okay. And so some of the processes that are going on. But yes, in some ways, at the same time, we also see it as one centralized function, which is malfunctioning, and then creating a unique set of symptoms for each person. So we call all of these illnesses neuroimmune condition syndromes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we call them NICs because they nick your energy, right? So neuroimmune condition syndromes. And all of the conditions that you've just mentioned fit under that type of label. So neuro, because it's in the brain and the nervous system; immune, because it's as a result of the immune system over-responding; conditioned, because it's become habitual response; and syndrome, because there's a unique set of symptoms for each patient. So the reason these conditions are so frustrating for doctors is because they want to pigeonhole people to say that person has this illness, we can define it clearly, and these are the drugs that will solve it. But with software problems, you may have the same software issue up here as me, but it will manifest as gut problems for me, but opportunistic infections for you. There'll be a different downstream manifestation.
Are there any conditions that people come to the Gupta program with where you're like, that doesn't fit into what we do here?
It's so fascinating you ask that question, because just over the last couple of months, we have been hearing of people using our program successfully for conditions that we never expected that they would be using it for. Yeah. So, for instance, Alzheimer's. So I'm presenting at the Alzheimer's Summit, and I would never in a million years have thought people are using it for that. But there are practitioners who specialize in Alzheimer's who say, officially, your doctor says that Alzheimer's can't be reversed, but we've put people on your program and their Alzheimer's is being reversed. Like, they are getting their cognitive and memory functions back. And I in no way have said that could ever happen, but they're telling me that. And now they're asking me to speak at conferences. And then even things like thyroid challenges, which also are connected to all of this. I've spoken at those conferences. Even cancer and diabetes, where a lot of people, once they have those diagnoses, have a huge amount of fear, and there's a huge amount of resistance to what's going on in their lives. But actually, by healing their nervous system and their immune system, they then can get better outcomes. So we're not saying this is a substitute for mainstream medicine, but what we're saying is it's an important piece that's missing, which is stimulating our own body's ability to heal itself. And how many times do we hear on, whether it be spiritual teachers or personal development teachers saying, oh, the mind's very powerful, you can heal yourself with your mind. But then they don't give you specifics on what does that mean and how do I do that? So what we've done is really, really make a scientific process of how you initiate your own brain and body's healing capacity to maximize its optimal healing state so it can heal itself. So that's why it's helping many different conditions. And, that's really exciting for us. And we want to go down the scientific route of proving this. So we're definitely working on scientific studies.
And so and excuse me for my lack of knowledge in the area, like I hear a lot about the limbic system when I'm thinking about brain retraining. And I know you've talked about amygdala. Could you talk us through what that is and what the difference, or is it linked, or could you just talk us through that?
Sure. So we have different parts of our brain, and there's a theory called the Triune brain theory, which has been kind of disproven to a certain extent, but it's an interesting model, which is that we have three brains, which have built upon each other during evolution. The first brain being the reptilian brain, which doesn't have emotion, it's just instinctual response. So if you touch a lizard, it may respond by running off, but there's no emotion connected to that. It's not afraid of you, it's just an instinctual response. Stimulus response would be the model there. Then we have this intermediate brain called the mammalian brain, which is the limbic brain. And that limbic brain sits in the middle of our brain and includes the amygdala, which is our fight or flight response, the threat response, our hippocampus, which is short-term memory, our hypothalamus, which controls a lot of the autonomic functions in our body, and a whole host of other structures in that part of the brain. And then built on top of that, we have the cortex, or rather the neocortex, some parts of the neocortex, which is the more rational thinking brain that many mammals have, but it's not as developed as it is in human beings. Yeah, and that sits on top. So that's the triune brain, 3 brains. And the limbic system is then our emotional brain. It's designed to protect us from dangers, and all animals have that kind of emotional brain. And generally, a lot of these threat responses that I've been talking about, we're specifically talking about the amygdala, but there's many structures involved. So your amygdala will take in incoming information, interpret it, and then create the appropriate autonomic response or nervous system response. So normally we call that the stress response. But now studies are showing the amygdala is also involved in pain responses and in immune responses. Because although medicine separates these different areas, our brain doesn't. Yeah? So when you have flu, it's not like you have flu and you feel perfectly emotionally fine, right? How do you feel when you feel flu? You feel down, you feel depressed, you feel demotivated, you don't want to do anything. Because the brain deliberately wants you to feel like that, so you don't go and run a marathon, but you rest at home and get over the illness. And so every physical illness has an emotional component, and every emotional illness, let's say depression, has a physical component. So we now know that 50% of depression is in fact overinflammation in the brain. So that limbic system essentially is designed to help us and protect us. Now, when we do brain retraining, a lot of, since we first launched, there have been many other programs that have come on the scene. They call it limbic retraining, but actually that's not strictly true, because the other brain structure that we are retraining is called the insula. And the insula sits between the limbic system and the cortex, and traditionally is part of the cortex. And that part of our brain essentially takes in all incoming information from the body, interprets it, so those are immune responses, our pain responses, and then creates an appropriate autonomic or immune response from the insula. So amygdala is more focused on threats. Insula is an overall homeostasis or balance in the body. And that structure is also one of the main structures that we are retraining. So we're retraining the amygdala for the nervous system, and we're training the insula for the immune system. And if I can take you through perhaps a very simple analogy that helps people really understand and get their heads around this, because it took me years to really figure this out. So I want to make it really, easy for people to get. So I don't know are you a fan of Game of Thrones by any chance?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. So you'll get this. And even if you're not listening at home, any fairy tale, right? So imagine you're the king of the castle, yeah, and you've got a kingdom, and your nervous system is your army, and your immune system is your navy. And they're designed to protect the kingdom and the castle. Then suddenly, there is a drought in the kingdom. So inevitably, the people in the castle are weak. So the castle itself is weak, and the army and navy are weak. They're weakened by this drought. Yeah? Now, suddenly, an invading army comes over the hill. Now, that invading army could be a stomach bug in my case. It could be Lyme infection, the Borrelia. It could be exposure to mold. It could be COVID infection. Yeah. Now, because the kingdoms are weak, those soldiers are ready to fight for every part of their soul to say, right, we've got to get rid of this invader because otherwise the kingdom falls and we all die. So they are valiantly fighting off this incoming army, and they work really hard to fight it off, and eventually they just about manage to fight off this incoming invading army. And their troops are like, oh, thank God for that. And you as the king are thinking, wow, that was a close one. That really was a close one. And then the generals come to you and say, hey, Phil, we only just managed to survive that, right? We're in a weakened state. You now need to channel all the body's resources to the army and navy, because if another army comes, we're not going to survive. And we think another army is just around the corner. So then all of the system's resources are going to your immune system and nervous system overstimulation. And those garrisons are in a state of readiness every moment. Yeah, they are firing arrows just in case. And then something does come over the hill, and it's really innocuous. It's just a group of men on horseback. And there are women in there as well. Sorry, I'm still using the analogies of Game of Thrones where they still got a sexist background. But yeah, and so you see this group of people coming over the hill, And that army and navy start firing those arrows, firing all those military machines, and using up all the energy resources of the castle. So all the grain, all the metal, all the leather, all go to the army and navy. And that's what happens in our bodies. That our systems, because they've been through a traumatic physiological event, they keep responding as if they are being attacked. Yeah. And before, 100% exposure to mold, which perhaps was a dangerous exposure initially, would create 100% reaction. Now, 5% exposure to mold, 5% of what you first exposed to, still creates 100% reaction. So our systems, and in neurology, this is called differential activation. It means that our brains, because it's very efficient, it learns to defend in an over-efficient way to things which are very innocuous, because survival is the number one priority. And then what happens, because the body itself is so weak, the kingdom's so weak, the army and navy keep taking more resources, and every time they detect that the body is even weaker, they demand even more resources to protect the body. And so we go in a vicious cycle where the brain says, gosh, we are in danger. So the generals of the army and you saying, well, we're in danger. So let's send out the army and navy. They go around the body, creating all this turmoil and physical problems in the body. Comes back, telling the brain, we're still in danger because look how weak the body is. Look at all these challenges we're facing. So the body and the brain then get into a game of tennis, constantly hitting balls at each other faster and faster. And that is one of the vicious loops in the brain and the body that causes continual chronic illness.
That was a great analogy. It makes so much sense, particularly when you're talking about something that's so small that now causes such a huge reaction. The example I always give is like one of my symptoms has been, and actually now I've noticed it's lessened, is like the smallest sound when it's like quite quiet will just make my nervous system jump. And so it's something that's not threatening at all. And yet there's something about, my nervous system finds it a threat, I guess. Thank you for taking us through that. I want to get into the questions we've been given from the listeners. I've been selfish in asking you my own questions. You've already answered this, so maybe I think we can agree that someone said aside from long COVID and CFS, can your program help heal other autoimmune conditions? And we've already, including RA, for example, that you've already kind of said that's the case, right?
And I would say there are three types of illnesses, right? The first illness that we experience is when our immune system is deficient. Yeah. And that might be where we have opportunistic infections like Lyme, HHV6, illnesses that occur because there are opportunistic infections in the body. So a lowered immune system or immunity. Another one is if we have an overstimulated immune system. So that would be chronic fatigue syndrome, long COVID, etc. And connected to that would be fibromyalgia, where there is a huge amount of inflammation going on in the body. And a third area is where the immune system itself starts literally attacking the body, like the lupus, the inflammatory bowel disease. And we have found that our program has helped all three types of patient. So what we're doing is, whether you've got an overactive immune system, an underactive immune system, or an immune system that attacks the body, we are aiming to rebalance the system and reset it.
So someone's asked, how would you describe your program compared to DNRS? What do you think are the differences in practice? This person's asking because they're trying to employ DNRS but having some difficulty or limbic resistance and sticking to the daily rounds.
Sure. So people may be not aware of this, but we were the first program to launch and use this type of processes. And since then, there have been a number of people who've, let's just say, how can I put this, taken inspiration from our program and adjusted it in their own way. And what the main difference is that we come from a very different space, which is some of these programs are like boot camps, which are very much, here's this process, do it again and again. And if you're not getting well, it's because you're not doing it properly and you're not doing it enough. Mm-hmm. So it's very much what we describe as a non-compassionate approach. And yet when you've got a huge sensitivity in your nervous system, we need to employ a more compassionate approach. So people need to be more compassionate with themselves and they need support. So the first thing is we're not boot camp style. And secondly, it's compassionate and holistic. So we look at the diet, non-inflammatory diet, the activity levels and pacing. Pacing is so important. Some of these programs don't incorporate that. We look at sleep. We look at getting into fresh air. We look at the importance of laughter and joy in boosting the immune system. So we feel that we're probably a lot more holistic than other programs out there. And also, we understand that people have often a background of trauma or anxiety or stimulated nervous systems, and that's important to recognize. And finally, one of the main differences also, people sometimes do get well on other types of programs, but they're not taught necessarily how to stay well. Because the moment you experience a stressful period in your life or a challenge or relationship breakup, many people have the symptoms come flooding back. So we want people to get well and stay well. So we go through the latter half of our program is very much about how are you going to keep yourself well by understanding your stress triggers, your different parts. So we deal with parts work, which is very powerful, and make sure that you have that awareness for the rest of your life to stay well. Because we don't want people to become complacent and say, right, I've retrained, I've got my health back, and now I can go back in the world and work 100-hour weeks and I'll be fine. No, there is a sensitivity in the nervous system that will continue, and we're honest about that. And how do you make sure that you stay well and find that rhythm and pattern for wellness for the rest of your life? So if people are on other programs, sure, that's fine. If they're getting great results with that, that's great. We're all here to get people better. But we certainly feel that we have continued with ongoing research, adapted our program, and continue to get feedback and improve it and make it holistic and make it compassionate. And generally, it's the people who have that perseverance and self-compassion that get the best results.
Cool. And you mentioned stress then. Someone's asked, do you have any tips for handling unavoidable stress when healing from CFS? Because I think a lot of people are under this impression that they need to avoid stress, but it's just impossible. Obviously, we all live in a stressful world. So what would be your tips in those situations when there's unavoidable stress when healing?
Sure. So we give the analogy of pressure is what we experience from the outside world. Stress is our emotional response to those pressures. Yeah. Now, once again, that's not blaming anybody for feeling stressed. Naturally, if you're in those situations, you're going to experience stress. But it is about our emotional reactions to our environment. Yeah. And therefore, that's empowering because we can begin to soften those responses. Now, stress is in everyone's life, right? Name me anyone who's not stressed or doesn't have something going on. Mm-hmm. So it's no point trying to think, well, I just need to avoid stress. It is about teaching ourselves to better handle those stresses. So we incorporate the 3 R's of the program. So the first R is retraining the brain. So that's the core bit. But we also look at relaxing the nervous system. So how do you use breathing and meditation processes to calm your amygdala and your brain? How can you learn how to not react to your parents or your siblings or your friends or whatever? How can you calm this whole nervous system? So our program is definitely right in on that to say, how can we better handle stress? And the third R is re-engaging with joy. So this is a very missed aspect of healing. Yeah, you may remember the film Patch Adams with that doctor that healed people from cancer through laughter. And in the same way, when often many people who have these illnesses, they think, I can only be happy when I'm better. Yeah. But actually, there is no journey to peace, or there's no path to peace. Peace is the path, right? And so therefore, we have to generate that internal laughter and joy and appreciation of the small things in life. And once we understand that, that also contributes to healing as well and makes us more stress-free. I always say to people, try smiling and feeling down at the same time. Right? Yeah. It's a difficult one. Or try laughing and feeling down. So we can control our moods and emotions through these different little tricks that we can employ. Now, once again, that's not false positivity. So we're not saying go out there and pretend nothing's wrong and just put a smile on your face all the time, because that's also not beneficial. But actually, there are so many opportunities in life to laugh and smile and enjoy things and give yourself permission to do so.
So I found for a long time that I had my life on hold. I would say, when I get better, I'll do this. When I recover, I can go to that place and all of that kind of stuff. And for a long time, I put my happiness on hold. And then I think the decision of making of myself making to just enjoy my life whilst I'm on this recovery was quite a powerful one. Do you feel like people do put their lives on hold and they lose years to doing that? Because that's kind of, I felt like I was almost on the path to losing years of my life, just putting it on hold. Could you see that a lot?
Yes, people do that. And also they put their lives on hold, which to some extent is natural because they don't have necessarily the energy levels. And at the same time, they feel like they're not allowed to do things for themselves or enjoy things, or be happy and smile, and that kind of putting on hold as well. And what I would say to people is, it can feel like, oh, my peers are all moving forward with their lives and they're getting jobs and doing all this kind of thing, and I'm being left behind, as a common fear that people have. And I would say, you know what? The growth that we go through when we go through these chronic illnesses is much more important and powerful. And we don't value that in modern society. But when you have an illness, it gives us a chance for self-reflection, self-awareness, working on yourself, working on your patterns, working on your fears. And that is the real spice of life, in my view. That is the real purpose of life, not going out and working 20 hours a day and earning loads of money. That's not the point, right? And when you retire, we'll all realize that. So understanding this journey of growth and really realizing that this illness can be an amazing facilitator of our own growth.
I couldn't agree more. Some days it's difficult to be on board with that, but yeah, I do agree with you. A great question here. So someone's said, how do I tell the differences between symptoms of limbic system dysfunction or amygdala and real triggers? For instance, if I'm in a place with a musty smell and I start to feel sick, should I stay there and just do my practices or remove myself from the situation?
Yeah, we get this question a lot. So the first thing is that with sensitivity reactions, and they can be mold, it can be chemicals, it can be foods, we don't expect you to right away go into exposures. The first thing is or deliberately, the first thing is to build up our strength and retrain. So we first of all ask people to train at home without deliberate exposure to strengthen the nervous system and strengthen those responses and those fears they're having, because often those fears are continuous. Then, step by step, slow, gentle exposures when someone feels ready. And then we give people the tools that when they're in those situations, they can then retrain. And of course, when you're in those situations, if you retrain and it's just spiraling and getting worse, then you pull back. So there's a form of pacing, which let me pace my exposure with my newfound tools, see what happens. Yeah, great, that's working. And in that way, we've had people within weeks who've been able to go back into places like shopping centers where there's fragrances and been absolutely fine as long as they continue with their tools. And eventually, after a couple of months, they'll be able to roam freely and not even need the tools because they've fully trained their system to no longer be sensitive to those chemicals or mold and things like that. And remember, it is about persistence and perseverance because these are survival instincts, right? So imagine you're in a restaurant and when the waiter comes over and hands the plate and he always says, careful, sir, the plate is very hot, right? Now, my first instinct is, I want to touch that plate and go, well, how hot is this plate actually, right? And but the point is, when you put your hand on a hot plate, the instinctual protective response is lift the hand off the plate, right? You don't have control over that. It's an instinctual response. Now, imagine that's the same thing as these limbic system responses, or what we call brain responses, which are this mold is dangerous or this chemical is dangerous. We must instantly create this allergic reaction to warn this person and get them out of that situation. Now, you're telling your brain, actually, this is safe. It will take continual practice with self-compassion, so not boot camp style, but with self-compassion, to persuade the brain that you are safe in that environment. And that is really what we're doing. So to that person who's asked a question, only deliberately expose yourself and stay in safe in places where you're exposed once you've gone down the line of brain retraining.
I think the fear that I imagine a lot of people have, and I used to have a lot, was that it would set me back. Like I would reverse months of, work and stuff like that. And what a recent I guess in the last year, its mindset switch has been that it actually won't. And yeah, I might get a reaction, and if that does happen and it causes a couple of bad days, it's not going to get rid of all the good work I've been doing. And I feel like that's been quite like a powerful thing to think. And would you say, because it's almost like, what's more harming to someone, the actual stimulus, the mold that's there, or the thought that it's going to set them back loads? Would you say it's the thought, really?
Well, it's what we're doing is training our brain. This is dangerous. Oh, I've had a reaction. Avoid the situation. You're reinforcing the protection mechanisms in the brain, not realizing that that's what's happening. And therefore, it becomes worse and worse. So the brain says, okay, I have this protective response. And if I'm getting that reinforcement from this person, that means that what I'm doing is correct. So just like you're the king of the castle, if the army and navy are sending off their defensive reactions and you say, all right, commanders, generals, yes, that's correct. Keep doing what you're doing because this is dangerous. They're going to fire even more arrows and missiles at the incoming invaders. And so there's a reinforcement of that. And and there's a lot of damage being done, unfortunately, on forums, especially in the area of mold or chemicals, which is you're going to have this forever. There's no cure. You need to avoid all kind of normal life. And that's the only way to survive. And if you don't, you're harming your body. And that is harmful because there's not necessarily any evidence of that. Or, we can't say either way. But then people start going and living in caravans in the middle of Arizona. Yeah. Right? That is no way to live life. All you've done there is reinforce to your brain that I need to avoid these situations. And if there really was, if mold, let's take an example of mold. Certainly people who get mold, there can be some genetic aspects which mean they're less able to detoxify, which means their brains are more reactive to mold. At the same time, if mold really was dangerous in that house for everybody, then everyone will be having an allergic reaction. Why is that one person having a reaction and another person not? It's because the brain has decided that that's dangerous and therefore is creating this defensive response. Now, if you can retrain that defensive response, I'm not saying go and live in a moldy house, but at least you can live a normal life and not have these overreactions. So there's a real balance here. Yes, we live in an environment where we're exposed to more chemicals, and the more we can live in a chemical-free environment, the better. But at the same time, if living in that situation is compromising your ability to just do day-to-day things, then that needs to be retrained. So it's appropriate level of defensive response, not an over-response. And I'll give you a classic example of this. We have people who come in and they say, I can only eat 3 foods, right? Because what's happened is they've gone to a dietitian or nutritionist and that they've said, right, food exclusion, you need to exclude these foods. Yeah. And now that hasn't worked, right? Let's try excluding these foods. And they get to the point at which they are training their brain unconsciously without realizing it to avoid all of these gamut of foods. And they're down to 3 foods. And they use our program and gradually they introduce lots of foods back into their diet. And eventually they can eat anything because they've trained the brain that this is not something dangerous. Yeah. So it's a balance. Let's live in as much of a chemical-free world as possible. At the same time, let's retrain these over-defensive responses.
Yeah, but when I found out about mold, I was like, missing piece of the puzzle. And then I immediately bought the book called Avoiding Mold or something like that. And there's Facebook groups called Mold Avoiders. And it was the worst thing that I could have done. There was stories of, as you say, people having RVs in the middle of the desert. And it's definitely not the way to live.
No, definitely not. And we have people getting better from mold. So if it really was the mold, then 100% no one would get better. Yeah. But we have people who use our program and they can then be in the same house they lived in, but no longer having mold reactions. And they can even go into wet, moldy areas, even in the woods and whatever. And they can feel a reaction coming on, but they use our tools and they're able to stop the reaction and therefore go on to live a normal life. Now, that wouldn't be possible if it truly was the mold alone that was causing the problem.
And next question here, which I actually think I know the answer to, but I'll let you answer it. So someone's asked, why do the majority of symptoms of limbic system dysfunction start on one day after a perfect storm? So essentially, kind of, someone could just have their whole life taken away from them in a matter of days. And why can't the recovery or reset be just as quick? Why is it so gradual? I guess the reset. And they said, thank you for everything you're doing. I'm your biggest promoter here in Mexico. So,
oh wow, fantastic! Yes, we have the program. Funny enough, coming in the new program coming in Spanish pretty soon, so people will be able to get it there. So this is a really interesting question. There are more projections from the amygdala up to our prefrontal cortex than there are projections from the prefrontal cortex down to the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex being our conscious rational mind up here. So we'll go back to our analogy of the king of the castle and the army and navy. What happens over time, you have been able to persuade the army and navy that, look, the kingdom's doing pretty well now. The drought's over. Everything's pretty good. You guys can relax, right? So the army and navy think, right, all right, we'll not be firing arrows anymore. We can rejuvenate. System comes back to balance. Yeah. Then what happens is an invading army comes over the hill. Now that invading army is as a result of the stress that we've put ourselves under. So maybe we've overworked, maybe we've, whatever it is that we know are our triggers, or overexposed in some way. So an army comes over the hill. Now the army and navy, they still have that traumatic memory of the previous times. So they go into that over defense mode, start firing off all the arrows to try and defend. But even once they've defended against that infection or whatever it may be, they are still now stuck in that mode. And you as the king of the castle go, hey guys, look, we've, the threat is over. You guys can reset. But they're like, no, but you don't understand. Another army may come, and that happened last time. So we've got to be super careful. So once they're triggered, there's more signals going from them to you as the king than there are from you as the king back to the army generals. And we see that in the neurology of the brain. And therefore, it takes a while to retrain them to settle down and reset the nervous system and immune system. But certainly with our tools, once people get used to it, within hours, they can get it reset. Or it might be a couple of days, they can reset it after a trigger. Mm. Whereas it may have taken weeks and months to get back to normal.
Would you also say that although someone might have not been having like debilitating symptoms, their problems actually started years and years ago, and it's not necessarily a perfect storm. It's more of a case of it's the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yes, exactly. So we use this analogy of a bucket. So imagine all the stress that you can take is like a bucket. We all have our own sized bucket depending on our resilience. So into that bucket goes emotional stress, but also physical stress. We can overstress the body physically working, let's say, or we have athletes overtraining syndrome. So you can overdo your body. Then there can be chemical stress. So all the pollution and all the chemicals that we're consuming, they all go into this big bucket. And when the bucket gets to the top, the straw that breaks the camel back is when the water flows over the edge of that bucket, the stress. And then we get illness. And that could be diabetes, that could be heart disease, that could be chronic fatigue, it could be a whole host of different conditions. And absolutely, that perfect storm, as you say, is just when the system has reached its limit and can no longer have the capacity to handle the stresses of life, whatever source they may be.
What advice would you give for people struggling to do rounds-based brain retraining? This person has said it's hard to access good feelings when you're in a state of freak out.
Sure. So we definitely recommend working with one of our coaches. So we've trained 20 or 30 coaches. We've got another 30 or 40 coaches coming on board, which is great. So soon we may have up to about 50 or 60 coaches available worldwide to support people. Because definitely, if we've been through challenging times in our lives and we can't access good feelings, or we can't access what we call the loving self, then a practitioner can help us understand those feelings and how to connect with them. And at the same time, in our program, we've also got lots of different ways in which people can access good feelings and start taking joy in the small things. Yeah. It's just a question of accessing memories. Like all of us, no matter what background we've had, there's been a moment when we felt happy. No matter what our backgrounds, there's a moment when we've actually felt love in some way. It could be love for a pet even. So it's just accessing those feelings and then using those feelings to create a sense of safety in the brain and train the brain that we're no longer in danger.
So I've people who are listening to this will be, I'm like a broken record with this. The thing that I've had difficulty with throughout when I've done brain retraining is when I've done like visualization or remembering old times and stuff like that. It's not like I can't remember good memories, and I can remember them, but tapping into that feeling and actually having the feeling is really difficult for me. I find that incredibly frustrating. And I know when I've talked about it on these podcasts, I know there's other people who've had that as well. So what would you say to someone who's finding it difficult to actually tap into that feeling, or even though they can remember that good time?
So there are two things here. First thing is, we can use our imagination not only with a memory, but also what we imagine it would feel like. So when people say, I can't tap into it, and you say, but if you could, what would it feel like? So we trick the brain. Okay, yeah, you can't feel that, but if you could, what do you imagine it would feel like?
Okay.
And if people have issues with that, then they can imagine, right, somebody else I know, it might be a family member, a friend, a girlfriend, when they're happy and smiling and enjoying something, put yourself in their shoes. How do you think they might be feeling? So it's accessing the power of imagination and recognizing that our brains are constantly imagining the worst right now. So that creativity is definitely there, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't be imagining all the worst case scenarios. How do you tap into that creative energy? And therefore, it's about imagining how other people might experience it or how that feeling might feel.
Yeah.
Secondly, we talk about breathing and meditation. So actually, when we breathe and meditate, we calm down all these rigidities in the brain, and it becomes easier to imagine and access good feelings. So some of our people find breathing and meditation very useful. Third way is actually kind of the somatic experiencing, which is things like yoga, walking in nature, getting back into your body. What they enable us to do is be more grounded in our body so we can imagine feelings better. Because in a lot of these illnesses, the body is like almost a source of danger. We start vibrating up here. That when we're worried up here. Yeah? People, when they have that buzzy feeling, wired but tired, you're just up here. You're no longer in your body. You can't feel your body because your body is your source of pain or source of symptoms. So what breathing and meditation techniques do, and we have some special ones, they enable you to get grounded back in your body so you can start feeling things again. Like Phil, I would guess that if you're having challenges accessing those emotions, do you also notice a certain numbness? I don't want to make this about you, but a certain numbness about certain emotional experiences, for instance, perhaps finding it harder to feel happy in a situation, etc. Some of those things are connected to that inability to connect to past emotions, because it's like we're not back in our bodies and we're feeling a little numb, and the brain's in this active, anxious state, so it can't access good feelings. Yeah, and then it's laughter and smiling. So even just the physical aspect of just laughing at something, you know, a crazy YouTube video or something that makes you laugh, just laughing out loud at something ridiculous, yeah, can be enough to get the state shifted and you can go back into that imagination. Or a piece of music. Yeah, so for me, the music that there's music that really gets me in the mood, like Eye of the Tiger I might listen to, or something by Coldplay. I'll listen to that, and music has a brilliant way of shifting your emotional state and putting yourself into a good vibration. So that can be another way. So we get people to think of their emotions, think of their memories, and attach an amazing piece of music that they can then instantly put on, and it puts them into that state.
I think what I've a recent realization is that, and I didn't ever think I was, is that I'm actually a bit of a perfectionist not in a good way. I'm like in the, and I know it's actually never been good to be a perfectionist, but like the reason why I never thought I would was because I was always happy to hand in like a 7 or 8 out of 10 piece of work at university and stuff like that. But when it comes to doing this kind of stuff, I was always like, if I'm not doing it, if it's not at 100% and it's not working, And I think, yeah, what would be good to hear from you is with these kinds of things, if I'm able to change my mood and, you know, raise it by, you know, I'm 20%, for example, and it's not like I'm suddenly just deliriously happy. Is that a good enough of a shift, at least to begin with, to get going?
Yes, exactly. So perfectionism can be a resistance to putting the program into practice and can actually create barriers to the experience. Yeah. Because as you say, if you're a perfectionist, you say, right, I've got to really imagine this memory, but I'm not getting it. So there's something wrong. So the thought comes in, there's something wrong. It's not working. I can't do this. Yes. And that thought process then completely pushes down any emotion that you could have experienced. Yeah. And that's why we say, what unfortunate is that there are other programs out there that have got this boot camp mentality, which unfortunately plays to people's perfectionist and achiever states, which is counterproductive for this type of brain retraining. It needs to be done with a sense of acceptance, a sense of letting go, a sense of whatever happens is fine, and a sense of self-compassion that, okay, if I'm not doing it right, I'm not doing it perfectly, let me do what I can manage. Because any achiever things, any perfectionist things, they will create barriers to experience. Yeah. And that's incredibly important.
Thank you for that. I think me and probably a lot of people need to hear those kinds of words.
Yeah, and that perfectionist tendency, there is once again, we never say these conditions are in the mind, they're in the brain. But there are definitely precursors. And some of those are things like perfectionism, highly conscientious achievers, people who are helpers, where they've grown up with parents they've had to look after, or they've had to always feel like their needs are not important, they must go out and help everybody else. Or people who've not felt good enough, or felt that they aren't loved. So people who judge themselves and judge others and judge, quite down on themselves. So that we know there's a certain set of different types of personalities that are more prone to this because they're more prone to anxiety. And when people become aware of that, they can make sure that those personality traits don't tag on to the very process of brain retraining itself.
And this is exactly what you mean by health being our biggest teacher, the chronic health, like as in we become a better person through going through this because, we learn, how to not, everything doesn't have to be perfect for everything to work. And it's just an unbelievable lesson to learn in our lives, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. And that's why we say our program is not just about brain retraining. It's a whole transformative program, because it's like the analogy of the caterpillar to a butterfly, right? So a caterpillar has to go into a cocoon, and that cocoon is painful for the caterpillar because it's going to be sprouting wings. And that cocoon is literally how an illness feels, doesn't it? We're suddenly isolated from the world around us. But that cocoon is a powerful process of transformation into the butterfly. So the butterfly can fly, and there is a transformation. What we don't want people to do is be in that cocoon, come out like a butterfly and come out like a caterpillar and continue like a caterpillar in the way that they were living before. There is a transformation, and these conditions transform us in some shape or form, and we want to take advantage of that and awareness of that. Yeah,
perfect. We've got 3 more questions if you've got time. Is
sure.
That? Yeah. So someone's asked, have you got any recommendations or your experience with more physical treatments for autonomic nervous system dysfunction? Some people seem to be able to retrain their brains using tilt table exercises, intermittent hypoxia, Wim Hof breathing exercises, or cold showers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about the vagus nerve and vagus nerve exercises. And if I may be so bold to say, to go against the convention, it's a bit of a red herring. Yeah, because what a lot of people are saying is there's this vagus nerve, so the vagus nerve, for people who don't know, is a nerve that runs from the brain. It's the longest nerve in the body. It runs throughout the entire body to all the organs, and it carries the opposite of the fight or flight response, what we call the rest, heal, and digest, also known as parasympathetic response. And we know that in these conditions, it's understimulated. So people then think, okay, well, maybe if I can stimulate that nerve in some way, so there's different devices you can get to stimulate that nerve, or there is cold showers or cold exposure, which we know stimulates the vagus nerve. But the thing is here, the vagus nerve still gets its instructions from the brain, right? And therefore, the vagus nerve doesn't operate in a vacuum. And so there are many different things. There are breathing, meditation, cold exposure, which can stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. Yeah, they can also make our veins and arteries more flexible. So all of these things are beneficial. And we definitely recommend them if they help people. So certainly with cold showers, those are things that you introduce very gently and slowly, because if you have a nervous system, if you then suddenly have a cold shower, you may actually make things worse. Yeah. So it has to be introduced very gently. So you might start with cold water on your feet, then the next day cold water on your legs, then the next day maybe on your waist, so that you're building up your tolerance slowly. So all of these things can be useful, but we feel like also go to the root cause, which is when you train the brain, all those downstream things will be helped. Now, we're not dogmatic. We don't say don't do physical things. Find physical things that can help you, but but the problem is a lot of people will see nutritionists and whatever, and unfortunately, some of them, not all of them, some of them still operate from a pure reductionist philosophy, which is, right, this enzyme is low, you're not going to get better until you fix the enzyme, so you need to take X amount of supplements and X amount of this. Yeah. Now, that may help some people, but and we're okay with that. But if it starts interfering with their belief in the program and the brain retraining, then it can become counterproductive. So yes, so in summary, if there are other physical things that can help, that's fantastic. Do those things. We also recommend supplements and anti-inflammatory diet, but focus on the brain retraining as the core.
Perfect. So someone here said that they, through their first couple of months of brain retraining, they had very powerful rounds where they felt like they were in a hypnotic state, experienced profound healing. But then after that first month or two, they lost access to this state, and the healing that they experienced similarly plateaued. Is it necessary to reach a trance-like state in order for these rounds to be effective? I hope not. Can a person never experience that state and still heal? What is the role of an altered state of consciousness in the process of healing limbic system dysfunction? Is it necessary, or is it a bit of a luxury? Sorry, there's a lot of questions there, but good question.
That's okay. Yeah, I mean, it's similar to the question that you've asked about accessing those states of being. Now, we would say it helps, but it's not necessarily the whole story. And so when you're accessing previous memories, that is one aspect of brain retraining. Yeah. In our program, we also have a lot of parts work, which is connecting with isolated parts through loving states. And that people find a lot easier to connect with. We also have another technique called the accelerator process, which doesn't require you to access previous positive memories. The breathing and meditation supports that, and music that we've talked about. So I would say it's not necessary to reach those trance-like states to persuade the brain that you are safe and it can switch off these defensive responses. It's helpful, but not required necessarily.
Yeah. I don't know. I see those because I went to a Joe Dispenza a week-long retreat, and there are people there who have these miraculous healings in one go because they reach this crazy trance-like state. But I guess I see that as, that's a quick way of doing it, which is amazing if you can get it. But otherwise, there was just more of a gradual path to it where you're, as I said, if you're, making yourself 20%, you're raising your emotions, by 20% in that instance from what you're doing, and just doing that continually over time, that will make a difference. Is that, would you say that's right?
Yes. And we're very cautious of big bang healing. So definitely there are, in many different spiritual healing traditions, there have been times when people have had these miraculous healing experiences, and we want that to be sustainable. So if you only go to a retreat and you have this amazing response, you can't be doing that every week.
Yeah.
You're back to normal life, normal reality. So we want to empower people to be able to access those healing states continually every day.
Yeah.
And therefore, having the step-by-step retraining, I think, is more powerful because it's longer lasting. So when a stress comes into your life, you have the toolkit to be able to overcome that and get your health back. So I prefer the step-by-step process.
So what kind of scientific studies have you actually done on the treatments you offer?
Yeah, so for us, it's really important to have the science backing behind this, because people can claim all kinds of different things can help, but it needs to be objective. So we've had a clinical audit which was published showing, once again, that our treatment got 2/3 of patients to a 90 to 100% recovery within a year. And then we've also had two RCTs, so randomized controlled trials, published. The main one was just published a couple of years ago with fibromyalgia patients. And that was the first randomized controlled trial ever published for a neuroplasticity brain retraining program or Limbic program. So we're very proud of that we're the only organization that has that research. And that study was on fibromyalgia, and it showed that after just 8 weeks of intervention, in the control group, there was 0 impact on fibromyalgia scores. But in our group, there was a 40% reduction in fibro scores in 8 weeks. Yeah, and they got better and better. And there was a halving of anxiety and depression. There was a halving of pain, and there was a doubling of functional capacity. Yeah, and we're a 6-month program, so that was just an 8-week intervention, and there's very, very low effects in the control group. So that's a published study, and that was published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine. So that's now spurred us on to do more clinical studies. So we're doing studies on long COVID, fibromyalgia, ME/CFS. We want to do things on mold, even Alzheimer's, right? So we want to show that this is effective for a broad range of different conditions. And so that's all work in progress right now.
Okay, cool. I've got a question here that's maybe a little bit more difficult in that they just want to ask about, they want to know what the success rate is, which I know is going to be difficult to answer. They actually said that they have done your program. They said that the Soften and Flow meditation is a great resource available on the app, but for them, they're not recovered and it hasn't really worked. And they said it's great because he always tells people to try it because there's a money back guarantee, so you have nothing to lose. So I know that's, I really sympathize with people who run these kinds of courses, because you can have the best course ever, but if it's not applied in the right way, and I'm not saying this person didn't do that, but if it's not applied in the right way, then it's not going to work. So do you have a success rate?
Sure.
What do you do when people are really not able to get there? What's the response to that?
Sure. And look, there can be programs out there claiming 100%, 95%. There's no program that ever does that. And so when we conducted a clinical audit of our patients, which was a published study, we found that after 1 year of using the program, 2/3 of patients reached a full recovery. So what we call an 80 to 100% recovery. Yeah, so that's a documented study. So 2/3 reach 80 to 100% recovery. And once people get to 80, 90%, they no longer have the condition, but they are now rehabilitating themselves back into normal life. And that may take a little time. And then about 90% improved and about 10% had no response from our program. So we are open and honest that, of course, there will be some people who may not have a response. But even then, as you say, it's about application. So we find our success rate definitely goes up a lot more when people take the one-on-one coaching. Now, all of our coaches are trained by me. It's a 2 to 3 year process. So it's very in depth, and they're also trauma informed. So they're aware of trauma and its impact on these conditions. And working one-on-one, you start unlocking and uncovering things that perhaps you didn't become aware of in doing the program yourself. Yeah, because sometimes we need someone external to make us more aware. It could be application of the tools. It could be a part. It could be an emotion you're not aware of. And so I would advise that person to work with one of our coaches, and that can really help unlock and uncover what might be the block to recovery. And sometimes, there are people who use many programs who don't have any response, but once they work one-on-one, suddenly their health improves because they've had that support.
I would actually just also urge, when I don't know this person, so I actually don't know who asked this, but I would just always urge anyone to be just completely honest with themselves and just, were they consistent with it? Did they do it all of the time? Because when I'm honest, and I did a recent episode where I did an update by myself, and I wasn't beating myself up, but I was like, I haven't consistently done it, so I can't say that something doesn't work if I haven't done it exactly, not exactly, but perfection's coming out there. I can't say it doesn't work if I haven't done it at least for the period of time it was meant to consistently. So I just think that's always the first question someone should ask. So I just thought I'd throw my 10 cents in there.
No, it's very important what you said there, because we have a lot of people say, oh yeah, I'm doing the Gupta program. But then when we ask them, they're not actually doing it daily. And we don't want people to put pressure on themselves, but we do say, look, half an hour a day as a minimum, we think everyone can invest that in their health in one sitting, and then small techniques throughout the day. So people can be working full time and they can still use our program. So it's not about time. It is about a commitment to one's health and being aware of the barriers that we may have, because the mind may say, oh, maybe this isn't going to work anyway. Or, I haven't got time, but then we'll spend half an hour scrolling on cat videos on YouTube or whatever, right? So it is about just putting it into your day, making it consistent. And we ask our people, like, what is the critical success factor to healing from these conditions? And we wonder, is it that tool, or is it that principle, or whatever? And the people who get better, they consistently tell us one thing. What got us better was just doing the program consistently. Yeah, there was no magic formula. There was no, I just did this one thing and that unlocked it. It was understanding the program, persevering with it, continuing with it. Yeah, and that is a different model to our medical model, which is 10 minutes with the doctor, give me a pill, fix my problem. This is an investment in our long-term health, and it's so worth it because it will just not only help you with this condition, but it will help you with your stress levels and all aspects of life, your happiness for the rest of your life. So it's so worth that investment of time.
Sorry, I did miss out a question. These are small questions, but someone's actually asked, why is the last 10% of healing the most difficult? I mean, I would say maybe the first 10% of healing is the most difficult. But yeah, did you ever heard that question before?
Yes, and there's a very simple reason for this, which is what we cover in the latter half of our program. Once you have retrained your brain, the way to think about it is, imagine, so in our program we use a left and right path. So let's say you have the left-hand path and all the river water is going down a left-hand path. So it's dug a channel. That's a neuron in your brain. Now what you're doing is diverting the water to the right-hand path continually. So you've dug a new channel on the right-hand path. And like we know with river and sediment, eventually the left-hand path gets covered in soil and grass starts growing and there's no channel there. And all the water is flowing down the right-hand path, which is a path of health and happiness. Now, another stress, as you then get back into normal life, you start then encountering new stresses. So you start perhaps a job part-time, or you start socializing a bit more, putting those extra stresses and pressures on your nervous system that weren't there before. And the sand or the soil on the left-hand path is still a bit loose, so a bit of water can go along the left-hand path if we're not careful. And therefore, it takes that last 10 to 15% is getting back into doing normal activities that you did before, still with a slightly sensitive nervous system. And how do you then monitor your stress levels, go deeper into the meditations, and retrain? So what a lot of our patients do is they'll get better in the 3 to 6 months of using our program. And then we say to them, the next 6 months is really important. Don't throw yourself back into a crazy job or a crazy social life or overdo it. Take your time step by step, that last 10, 15%, rehabilitate yourself back into doing those things, and don't become complacent with the tools. So meditate, you're gonna have to meditate for the rest of your life, or have some kind of calming activity for the rest of your life. And then what will happen is your nervous system will become so strong that you'll handle everything. You'll get to that 100%. Yeah. So now, I remember when I was getting better, it took me a while. I still had that sensitivity. Whereas now I can probably go 2 nights without sleep, or I can go running, or I can do whatever I want. And it's not going to create any dips in me because the system's now desensitized itself.
Yeah, that great answer. That makes total sense. And then just finally, someone asked, would you suggest that if they said physical treatments, I think they mean by like supplements or, you know, stuff that you can do through going through a practitioner, would you suggest that they do those first before doing the program? Would you suggest that you do the program first or just alongside, or completely separate? Like, what's your suggestion there?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because it all depends about your belief systems. So inevitably, if you're going to see a nutritionist or practitioner, we're not against that at all. And you can do our program in parallel, as I said, as long as your focus is our program. Because if your focus becomes, well, I just need to get these supplements to work, then you're not going to dedicate yourself to the program. And your belief system is, well, that enzyme's still low, so I can't get better. So if you can do it in parallel, as long as you realize that support is supporting the downstream effects, and you're in parallel working on the upstream effects, which are the core effects. And if you can balance those out, that's fine. Now, we have many practitioners, so functional and integrative doctors, who are now recommending our program. And they'll say, do Ashok's program first, because we can see your system is just too sensitive to handle any medications or treatments. And how often is it that people go and have these treatments and they feel worse? Yeah, they'll feel worse from the supplements or the injections or whatever, because the system's just saying, I'm in panic mode. I cannot handle any external chemical being put into my body right now.
Yeah. And also, not to mention the thousands of pounds that you can spend on supplements. So if you can get away with not spending that money, that would be a great saving. And thank you so much for coming on and answering all of the questions. Hopefully, I'm pretty sure I got through all of them. Yeah, it's really, really helpful. I think, you know, your program's been doing. I like the fact that you're saying you're iterating it as well. That, you know, that you're not just kind of resting on the 2010 version or whatever, you know, that you know, progressing, because I imagine things are changing every month, right, with your understanding of this.
Yeah, so we get feedback from our clients, we do surveys, and obviously medical science keeps changing. There are new supplements that get some proof behind it. Let's say coenzyme Q10, right? So that's something that we didn't used to recommend, but we do recommend coenzyme Q10 as something that supports mitochondrial function. It's not going to cure you, but it certainly just is that extra little support. So every week, every month, we're adding new videos to our content to enable people to have the best experience, essentially. Yeah.
Perfect. Look, thank you so much for coming on. We're going to get this out like pretty quickly. So yeah, I'm sure we'll have a really good response to this. So yeah, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.